are you doing?
Great. Yeah. No, just it's late in Swartland and cold in the Swartland. But I've got some wine. That's
Good.
number one right now.
I just tasted through the whole lineup, and spoiler alert, the Kloof Street 19 is so delicious. That is just a beautiful kind of. I wasn't going to dive into the wines right immediately, but I just, opened that, and it was just like a breath of fresh air. Really kind of vibrant fruit, and any of that. That wasn't the focus of anything, but it's now on the table here. So
it's a good way to start.
I really think that it'd be great for you to tell a little bit about the history of what you and Chris have been doing, because I just think it's such an exciting story, and it's part of a bigger story. And why don't you give us a little of the history of kind of what you guys have done, where you are, and kind of this adventure that you're having in the Swartland.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, people hear right away that I'm not from the Swartland, that I did grow up in California and studied winemaking. I didn't come from a winemaking family, but always, well, not always, but from a very young age, had a love for wine and knew that I wanted to be a winemaker from 17. So I studied winemaking, worked in the Napa Valley for a couple of years after, and then I decided to start doing my hemisphere swapping internships. Actually, at my very first day in university, there was a South African scholarship student there. And he happened to have a copy of, I think it was Wine Spectator that month. And it wasn't even on the cover, like a few pages in, there was just this picture of a wine estate in Stellenbosch. And it was just so beautiful physically. And the mountains, the coral pink color that the mountains turn at sunset. And I was just drawn to this picture, and I knew that eventually I would come to South Africa. So after working in the Napa Valley for a few years, I decided it was time to do my hemisphere swapping internships, and ended up in Stellenbosch and just instantly fell in love with the wines and the food and the people. But I had another internship lined up, 2004.
2004.
And then later that year, I had an internship in Chenin-based. And while I was there, I was visiting a friend in Champagne. And on the train on the way there was Chris. And so Chris is from South Africa. He's also not from a winemaking family. And he actually studied accountancy. He didn't study viticulture to begin with. But he always says that he had his midlife crisis at 22 years old and just started university right over again. But having that accountancy background is definitely beneficial when planning a business. So we met in Champagne, and but we were both working in the south of France. We worked together for a couple of years and realized we worked really well together. And that's when we took the leap to start our own winery in the Swartland, which at the time was a very unknown area. But since Chris and I didn't start with any resources or land or buildings, it was one of the more affordable areas to start a winery in. We were still in our 20s at the time, and we were able to have access to the most, in our mind, the most amazing grapes that were being farmed by the most amazing people. So to be strangers in a region and be accepted by those people to take over the grapes on their land, I mean, I think that's a very rare occasion for any winemaker anywhere in the world to have that opportunity. So we made the most of it.
Very, very cool. So I think it's kind of really interesting. We're talking about Chenin, obviously. We had Thibaut Boudignon and Jackie and Jean-Philippe Blot last week, and I think it's so interesting, the deep history of Chenin Blanc where you are. I mean, it basically was the 1600s where the Huguenots brought Chenin to South Africa. And I mean, it's just got this deep history. There's how much in relation to what's produced in France or grown in France? It's double.
So we have about twice the hectares of Chenin Blanc in South Africa compared to France, and we also have a very large amount of old vine Chenin as well, which, you know, the fact that the vines have been in the Chenin Blanc has been in South Africa since 1655, and the fact that we to this day have a large amount of Chenin Blanc, and that it can grow very old. You know, the oldest Chenin Blanc in the country is about 80 years old right now. The fact that it can grow old in drought conditions, dryland farmed, you know, old bush vines, and it's happy, it's yielding, and it tastes incredible. Like, it means that it's the right variety planted in the right area, even if it's so different from where it came from in the Loire.
That's amazing. Well, the other thing that you know, you and I have talked about previously is that California has a history with Chenin Blanc. You know, where you also were. That's a pretty interesting history in itself. Can you maybe remind people of a little bit of Chenin's history in California?
Yeah, so I mean, in California, until the 1990s, when Chardonnay became one of the primary grape varieties, Chenin Blanc was the #1 grape variety in California during that period of time, and to the point where there was about 300,000 tons of Chenin harvested in its heyday and grown all over, from Mendocino, you know, down through the south. It was really grown all over, and there were some interesting wines made for sure, but a lot of it was also going to more bulk style, or not bulk, I shouldn't say bulk, but more easy drinking wines, I'm going to say. And, you know, wasn't maybe taken as seriously as it should, but it definitely got a lot of people drinking wine. And you know, that's always, you know, you have to give it credit for that. And but there's still some very cool old vine vineyards of Chenin in California. You know, some of them are still own rooted. I know there's one down in Santa Barbara County, and then there's a great vineyard up in the Sierra foothills, Story Vineyards. That is just incredible Chenin vines up there.
So I think that's so interesting. You know, I think it's one of the things that Chenin is so versatile. It's such an amazingly adaptable varietal, as this kind of story that we just discussed hints at. And I mean, I remember talking to old timers in California going back 30 years, and Chenin was often the magic ingredient to balancing maybe an overripe varietal with some acidity, and it was kind of the secret ingredient of, you know, I think some more famous wines, but then, as you say, also some value-oriented wines, and then it slowly, I guess, every progressive decade from, say, the 90s on, it got reduced as Chardonnay and other varietals became king, and I guess economically it wasn't as important, which maybe is a great way to bring us to today and what you guys have been doing, and kind of this resurgence of Chenin Blanc the world over, because it has a great history, but I think the recent past and a lot of what you and some of your colleagues in South Africa are doing is raising the image of it, and we're certainly trying to do it in New York and in the Loire Valley. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that?
About the resurgence and what we're seeing.
Kind of, for like your history since you guys started there, and kind of how you see the development.
So the last 10 years, there's been this amazing upward trajectory of not just seeing Chenin out there, but seeing very high quality Chenin out there. You know, California, New Zealand, Australia, obviously in France, you know, they're going through an evolution, and predominantly in South Africa. You know, Chenin has also gone through its ups and downs throughout the time in South Africa. You know, it was very highly planted in the 1600s and then sort of tapered away when actually Semillon took over, and then has really made its resurgence in the 1900s, but at that time, a lot of it was being made trying to imitate the Loire. It was, you know, a bit off dry, lower alcohol, aiming for higher acidity, but there wasn't maybe necessarily the aim for balance and high-end Chenin. So it developed a little bit of a bad reputation locally in South Africa. It was referred to as steen, which means stone, because it was the cornerstone white grape in South Africa. But now, in the last 10 years, the I think key for why it has done so well is because of its adaptability and versatility, which you would think could be confusing for the consumer or maybe become a bit generic because of its adaptability, but it has the ability to be that real chameleon of terroir and take on the identity of where it's planted to the next level. People are so proud to highlight that identity of where those vines are planted into the glass.
So I think that's a great starting point to dive into some of your wines. In talking to Thibaut and Jackie and others, and yourself, obviously, I think that aspect of Chenin being a translator of its place is a really amazing trait. And I think it's not just that it's transparent, but I think that it's also that it amplifies place in a way that is pretty extraordinary. And there are these very, very terroirs. You make no less than 3 different single terroir-based wines, plus your old vines, and then the Kloof Street is something slightly different. And I think it works very well in deep limestone like you have in Mullineux and Vouvray, and then you've got schist in Savennières. You've got a combination of kind of volcanic soils with clay and Anjou, and I mean you've got all this kind of diversity. And as you note, it all translates into a variety of wines that really reflect their place. And I think one of the things that's I think been also part of this resurgence is the farming. I think that everywhere the farming has improved so dramatically in the last 30 years that I think that has been, in my view, in the Loire Valley, and it's still got a ways to go, but the top growers have taken it to such an amazing level. Can you maybe discuss a little bit your farming and how you see that playing as a factor?
Yeah, absolutely. We're dealing with some of the oldest viticultural soils in the world. When you talk about the Loire, and you're talking about limestone and volcanic soils. Those are all soils that were formed by tectonic action, recent tectonic action, whether it's pushing up off the ocean floor or volcanoes. And
recent being about what? Recent being how long ago? I mean, we're talking
100,000 more or less.
100 million.
No, maybe a bit more. But in South Africa, our soil is about 400 million years old, and
exactly.
So we have incredibly ancient and therefore incredibly fragile soils in South Africa. So it's impossible for me to talk about farming above the ground if we're not talking about how we're preserving at ground level and below. Soil erosion is one of the biggest problems with agriculture around the world. The stat I always quote is that since World War II, the world has lost 30% of its topsoil. Now, obviously, vines can sustain life in quite nutrient-poor soils relative to other agricultural crops. But we're already dealing with incredibly fragile soils, so we need to maintain those. And you can't maintain those with chemicals and with heavy farming. You need to be as gentle and as natural as possible. So we're not spraying, we don't have any pesticides, for example, because we have this incredible bird in South Africa, a guinea fowl, which looks like a prehistoric chicken. And they just live in mass quantities all over our farm because there's already a balance of life. There's bushes for them to hide in. Our natural bush is called fynbos, which means fine bush. Then there's plenty of insects for them to eat, so they keep them off the vines. The natural vegetation that's highly aromatic that runs through the vineyards. And that not only implements its own little fingerprint of South African terroir into the vineyard, but also it allows for a healthy predator-prey balance that comes right into the vineyard.
And you also have a lot of cover crop and you have some corridors. You have a lot of, I mean, it's an amazing ecosystem. You've described it a couple times, and it's. I mean, I think that's something that people love to hear about, because it's the whole that kind of makes it such a unique place.
Yeah, absolutely. And but that's on our property itself. We do have other sites that we work with, because in South Africa, because they're very ancient soils, it's very large areas of single soil types. So in a lot of European wineries, the beauty of the diversity of the soil in small areas is awesome, because you can cross the road and you're in a whole new terroir. In South Africa, because you have very large soil areas, because of the ancient soils, it gives us a different kind of positive. It gives us the ability to create very pure expressions of those soil types. And that's, some of the wines you'll be tasting today.
Great. Do you want to dive in a little bit to maybe the old vines, and before we get into the single terroir based wines, and then we can dive more into farming and kind of winemaking and such. In this wine, the old vines, which the base of it is old vine Chenin, is thank you, is kind of a very representative wine of your place. And also, I mean, I think it's just a great entry, not an entry level wine, because it's much, it's more significant than that. And we'll talk about the 10-year vertical that you just did. But I think it's such a representative wine of your place and kind of the history of the white wine, Chenin Blanc, in your area.
Yeah, and it really highlights the versatility of it. To be able to use Chenin Blanc as a backbone for a blend. The Old Vines Project was started about 15 years ago and is actually regulated in South Africa. So if you have a wine that says Old Vines on it in South Africa, it has to be verified that it is Old Vines, and each vineyard is registered as such. And Old Vines are, for me, super important, because it just highlights all of the characters. It concentrates all those characters you're looking for in Chenin or whichever variety you're working with. The skins are always going to be a little bit thicker. It's always more disease resistant because it's built up immunity. Vines can build up immunity the same way people can. They're slower growing, so you don't have these vigorous spurts. And it's weathered the seasons before. It's been there, done that. It's been through droughts. It's been through rainy years or cooler years. So you still absolutely get vintage variation with old vines, but it just buffers it a bit, so you don't get those extremes. And most of the vines we're working with are dry land, so unirrigated bush vine, so head trained goblet. And in other countries where Chenin is grown, they perhaps maybe want more sunshine on the grapes, sunshine to ripen the grapes, to develop the fruitier flavors. But in South Africa, we have plenty of sunshine. Like, sunshine is just inherent, and it's important to taste the sunshine in the wines. We're not trying to hide it. But by working with bush vines, it creates that umbrella effect over the entire fruit growing area. So we don't have, extreme morning sun or afternoon sun. It allows a dappled filtered light throughout the day.
Exactly.
And therefore is much better for the ripening of the grapes, more even ripening. It still allows Chenin to get those fabulous freckles that they get. When Chenin ripens, it gets freckles, and you can actually just visually see before you taste sometimes, like, time to pick. And then South Africa is also one of the windiest wine growing regions in the world. So by having the bush vines, which are much lower than the bush vines that you find in other parts of the world, sometimes they're referred to as a dead octopus because they're sort of on the ground and splayed open rather than really upright. And that's with the wind. It just keeps everything lower. It allows you to grow slightly, thicker canes that won't break off in the wind. We've adapted our own viticultural style to benefit the vines we're working with. And so for the Chenin and the old vine.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that also that wind and that it's also a benefit for organic farming and not, I mean there's a whole series of benefits obviously that come with that.
Yeah, I mean, as we know from the beautiful botrytis wines of the Loire, it is susceptible to certain kinds of rot, but not in the wind and the dry climate that we have in the Swartland. Chenin-based blends are very typical of our area and therefore are sort of a fingerprint of the identity of the Swartland and of South Africa. To use Chenin as the base, as the backbone, so the structure you get from Chenin, and then each winery blends in the varieties that are best suited to their properties. So in our case, it's also with Viognier for an aromatic lift. Claret Blanche is all about texture. You know, Claret Blanche in its youth doesn't offer a huge amount aromatically, but develops this amazing beeswax character with a couple of years in bottle. Semillon Gris, which is a whole nother seminar on its own. And then Grenache Blanc. Grenache Blanc always gives us a sort of salty acidity that just works so well with the type of acidity that we get in Chenin Blanc. Where I can co-ferment them together, I do. But with our white varieties that we work with, they actually come in over a varied period of time. And so I never want to co-ferment something together unless it's coming in same day, same time, and that it might not be potentially reserved for another wine as well.
I think there's an amazing kind of richness, texture to this wine. There's a density, a viscosity to it that is completely unique. There's a layered aspect to it, and it's seamless. There's no evidence of wood, and there's still kind of a saltiness at the core of it, but it's texturally very different than what I find in the Loire Valley in particular. And I was remembering you discussing kind of the thickness of the skins and the flesh of the Chenin there.
Yeah, so with the old vines and with the climate of the Swartland, the skins do grow a bit thicker, which also helps with disease resistance. But also, the juice ratio, the skin to juice ratio is totally different than in the Loire. We have much more pulpy grapes, so not dehydrated. They still are a full, plump, bouncy grape, but when you press them, I mean, our juice recovery is tiny. But you know, when you have grapes of that structure, you can't help but pull some of that substance out with it as you're pressing it. So, you know, I do handle the wines very oxidatively, but I do press very gently, just because they are such structured grapes themselves, and I don't want to pull out any negative phenolics. I think phenolics, there are a lot of positive phenolics to have in white wine. And when you have a hot, dry climate, it's those phenolics to give you that perception of freshness when the wine is dry. So I absolutely adore having just that hint of natural phenolic edge that you get from Chenin Blanc. But we are growing in a hot, dry place. And, you know, our version of what is ripe is maybe just borderline physiologically ripe. So we do have to be very careful with the handling of the grapes, not for lack of oxidation, but just so that we're not extracting out negative phenolics.
Well, the other thing that I noticed about this, and I was talking to Thibaut Bougnon about this morning, because I've been tasting the samples that I had from last week over the last 4 or 5 days, and there's this. I always joke with him because he was in Burgundy. In fact, I think some of his friends in Burgundy have joked with him about it, that, you know, they're like, you should have been a red wine maker. And, you know, I always say, and he acknowledges, that his Chenins have a tannic structure to them. I mean, they really have this red wine kind of build to them. And I find that in your wines too. And I mean, it seems like that comes kind of from the genetics and the skin and all of the material you get.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is definitely It's actually interesting because, you know, in the grape, I'm sorry, in the leaves themselves, in the petiolar sinus, where the stem and the leaf attach, you often get a little pink margin there. And it's actually kind of funny because I'm actually colorblind. I can't see pink, but I remember when I was okay, there we go. But I was studying in university, and one of my viticultural professors was saying, you always know a Chenin vineyard because when you drive by, it looks pink. And I've just taken their word for it. But
That's funny. Well, and you love to have your wines unfined and unfiltered typically too, which I think also, you know, just guards all of that intensity and you just don't lose anything. There's that added, I mean, for me, texture is a big part of wine, period, red and white. And anytime I mean, there are times that filtration or clarification is a benefit and you need to do it. But when you don't, I think you just have that. I always used to joke, you can eat it and drink it at the same time. And it's just, but there's just this amazing chewiness to your wines that I really, really love. I think that's a big kind of plus. And I think when Chenin is at its best, you have that structure to it that is very unique, and you don't necessarily get it in all white varietals. I don't feel. To me, it's a noble quality.
absolutely, it adds to the layers and the complexity of the wine.
Well, let's maybe move on to the. I have here. You could tell me the order if I'm doing it backwards. The quartz.
Quartz is an amazing stone. You know, throughout time, societies have revered quartz for its sort of energy capturing abilities. You know, quartz or silica. Actually, have a little piece of quartz here. So one of our sommelier friends, in Philadelphia, he refers to this now as rock show and tell, because I can't talk about the wines without having my stones with me. But quartz, so silica, and I actually grabbed a piece of Loire silex while I was here. Beautiful. It's also silica, you know. But Loire silex is a much finer, so it can cleave much cleaner and much sharper, where quartz is always just much more rough and jagged. And it's just so incredible the way, you know, in the vineyard, I talk about the protection of the canopy, but when there's a high quantity of quartz on the surface of the vineyard, because quartz is semi-translucent, it reflects a lot of sunshine back up into the canopy. So although the light is diffused from above, it actually can be almost more direct from below on the quartz soils. And when I first started making wine on the quartz soils, just my preconceived notion was that quartz kind of meant like glacial purity in a way, and it was going to be very linear. But I actually got the opposite thing of quartz. You know, when you take silex or when you take quartz and you strike it together in the dark, you get a spark. I mean, you can make fire from quartz. And that, for me, is exactly that transfer of energy that I get when I'm drinking the quartz Chenin. It's that extra spark of sunshine. And just to give a little background on the handling of these wines, to be an honest expression of the soil in which the wines are grown, I try to keep all other aspects the same. The vines are within the same age. They're farmed the same way. The pruning is the same. You know, the people in the vineyard are the same. All those aspects of terroir, the rain, the sunshine, the aspect, all of the aspects of terroir that can vary, we try and keep those the same as much as possible. So that way, when you're tasting the quartz and the granite or the schist or whichever soil we're presenting you, you know that the picking date, not the picking date, but the ripeness is the same. Fermentation is the same, the aging is the same. So any differences you're seeing really is the soil speaking.
So this I cheated. I opened up the granite last night because I got the quartz came today. So I'm just tasting this for the first time today, and I had to petition David Skurnick to give me a bottle because we have a very limited supply of it. So I was able to buy a bottle, and this reminds me very much, and it's interesting you pulled up the silex and the piece of quartz. This reminds me a lot of what you get in Mullineux, in some of the terroir and Vouvray and the terroirs that do have a lot of silex mixed in with the limestone. It's not identical, but there is a similarity, a family resemblance that's very, very interesting to taste. I have been tasting the Ousseau from Jackie Blow, which is the highest part of Mullineux, and there's a lot of silex in that, and also the Venise from Vouvray, the Clos Venise and Noisette. And again, there's a lot of silice on the surface, and it's got some family qualities that I find in those wines.
I was gonna say that's what's always so interesting about, when people think that they're seeing similarities in wine regions, oftentimes they think it's much more attributed to the winemaker than it actually is. A lot of that is, for me, the soil. So like with some of our other wines, for example, if someone says, oh, this wine reminds me a lot of Côte Rôtie, I'm like, actually, they're both on schist soils, things like that. And there's so much more to what you're tasting in the glass. Like in my mind, it's very little of the winemaker's hand. I mean, obviously you need to be there as the custodian to take it through its life, but to let the terroir shine through, when you're seeing the similarities in different wine regions, so much of it is, more than just the variety or the style. It's how it's grown.
Absolutely, and that shows through in this wine. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, we started to get into it because there is a transparency. I mean, I know your approach is hands off, and I think that's the approach of the best winemakers, is to kind of try to do things that aren't going to put a stamp on the wines, but are going to enhance the terroir and kind of the sense of place. And I mean, you use larger wood and neutral wood, correct?
Correct, yeah. So indigenous yeast, which obviously will vary from vineyard to vineyard as well. Indigenous yeast, indigenous malolactic, and working more with old wood. I love using wood as a fermentation vessel, especially with natural fermentations. It acts as a natural insulator as well, so it's more constant temperature. It acts as a nucleation point for the yeast or the minerals to adhere to, so it stabilizes faster. But I don't want the wood to be a flavoring component. So there's a lot of benefits to wood, but you have to be aware of how you're using it. And I usually use 500-liter barrels, or if it's a larger plot or something that I can co-ferment together, I do have a few 2,000-liter Foudre as well.
Great. So the wine we just tasted was the Quartz. That's 100% Chenin. There was a question, and the next two wines are also Chenin. So everything's Chenin tonight on the table, except for the old vines is predominantly Chenin with some other Mediterranean varietals in there. So let's jump into the Granite, and then we can compare a little bit. And so these two wines, the first wine, the Quartz, is a single site, correct?
Yes, yeah. In fact, they're both single sites, but the Quartz does have the name of the vineyard on it because it's the only vineyard we've ever used for that wine. We only have one Quartz vineyard. So the name of the vineyard on the bottle is Leliefontein, and that's the name of the vineyard itself. The Granite is, we don't have the name of the vineyard on it because we did switch vineyards a few years ago. There's no rules on how long you have to use a vineyard for before you put the name on the bottle, but it's just for our own integrity so that, whenever we put something on our label, it's that seal of approval as well. We have our name plastered across the front, so everything needs to be, something that the consumer can rely on as well. And the granite soil, so we have the decomposed granite. So these are pretty much the biggest size stones you'll find in the vineyard. But if you do that, I don't know if you can see that, but it comes apart pretty easily. And what that allows is the roots to penetrate incredibly deep in the granite soils. It becomes very sandy just under the weight of the stones. So if the roots can get very deep, and because vines always replicate above the ground what's happening below the ground, a deep root system means a much larger canopy area. More canopy means more shade. More shade means it's slightly cooler in the growing area on the granite soils. And that's not because the weather is cooler, it's because the natural structure of the vine creates a more shaded system. And therefore, we always retain a little bit more freshness, slightly lower pH, slightly better TAs on the granite soils. But because of those incredibly well-drained deep soils, they're much more devoid of nutrients. And being devoid of nutrients means that the grapes themselves have a longer, slower fermentation. You can tend to get more reductive fermentation. So even though I handle them very oxidatively, a slower fermentation where the yeast struggle a little bit more just because there's lower nutrients in the grapes means that you're going to have slightly more of a positive reduction to the wine. And that for me is part of the terroir because of the structure of the vineyard that's creating that.
That's funny. I mean, the Loire Valley's doesn't have there's been obviously drought years the last few years, which in some ways they're going closer. I mean, global warming is a big, subject, everywhere. And I'm curious, I've been talking about that with folks and trying to see, how they deal with it. And clearly Chenin Blanc is privileged with its high acidity, low pH, which is natural as a kind of a hedge against global warming. And I'm just curious, how you see that, and obviously it's a grape that has big advantages in today's climate change era.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, not only is it already buffered because of that acidity, but as you know, it's already highly adaptable as well. So it deals with the drought much better than some varieties that we've seen. And our version of drought might become the normal. Our version of previously normal might be where the Loire is going. We don't know which direction
Sure.
Climate change is going. And so the adaptability of Chenin is very important. But in South Africa, we are allowed to blend. It is definitely a privilege to be able to use other varieties in limited proportions. So in our Old Vines White, for example, going forward, we are allowed to blend varieties from other parts of the world as well. So we are doing experiments with Macabou, Verdelho, Vermentino, and Acertico. Just trying little small things. I always say that our children will either think we were visionaries or absolute lunatics for trying.
Or both, depending on the day.
Yeah. And but with Chenin as a single varietal wine, in South Africa we have 300 years of doing massal selection to help it in this environment. And so I think that in the Loire, for example, there's still a lot of play that they have. So they might need to adjust some things depending on what happens climatically, but it's definitely doable. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing that, thinking about back to discussing California, I mean, Chenin, one of the big advantages is that it is adaptable. It was kind of the secret weapon of some heavier whites that gave some freshness and in some cases was literally the star of the show without being on the label of some old, very successful California wines. And I think, you talk to people in the Loire Valley versus Burgundy, and obviously the harvest date is so crucial today to get it right. And there is this really kind of fine line between harvesting perfect fruit, balanced fruit, too ripe, underripe, and I think there is, as you say, Burgundy, used to talk to growers. There's people, visionaries, I think, that are thinking aligoté. There was a reason it was part of some blends or in fields, and it is a hedge with acidity against Chardonnay. And let's hope that the growers can continue to be Houdini and, be right on that perfect balance of getting the right harvest date. But I think, you're right. There is maybe a future for some adaptability to the rules that in fact historically may have been in place that we're not even aware of. Maybe a revolutionary comment for my.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, look at the changes that Bordeaux has made in the last few years. If they can do it, anyone can.
Absolutely. Talk about malolactic, because the Loire Valley, the growers, it's a different climate. It's a different, the grapes, the what they harvest is not identical, but your wines go through Malo, and most of the Loire Valley Chenins don't go through Malo. Can you just discuss that from a winemaker standpoint, or from wine growers and just in general?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the, I think, important things to realize in South Africa is with our climate, in South Africa, it's very warm at the end of harvest still. Our autumn weather doesn't kick in until at least a month after harvest. So we still have summer type weather towards the end of fermentation. So that means that you already have the ball rolling on malolactic, and oftentimes you have to interfere to stop malolactic fermentation. So I definitely love malolactic to go through because it wants to go through, and to make it stop, you have to interfere. But also you stabilize the wine by letting it go through malo. So you do lose some acidity in TA, but in warm, dry climates, we also have much higher levels of potassium in the grapes. Now, when you take acid and potassium, you get tartrates. And so we are very aware, that the wines can be more susceptible, more prone to dropping out tartrates. But when you drop out tartrates while they're still in the barrel, you're losing tartaric acid, but you're also losing potassium, and therefore you can actually be improving your pH even though you're losing acidity. So even though we're losing acidity, we're maintaining, if not improving, freshness in the wine. So long story short, that's why I love going through malolactic.
Well, and I mean, listen, I think too, if it wants to go through malo, then, as you say, stopping it, having to intervene in a aggressive, semi-aggressive fashion is, and frankly, it allows you to, by going through malo, so that you can not have to do any clarification of any kind, which adds to that beautiful texture that you get in the wine. So, I think I'm always for, the indigenous yeast letting things happen. I think there is a reason that nature takes care of things in a way that it knows maybe better than we do, and to let that happen, and I think it's clearly a benefit based on tasting the wine. So I was thinking, as we were talking about the kind of the gentle process of oxidation that in the barrels that they go through. I think that's part of the textural quality too. And your wine seems so strong. There seems to be a strength to them, which I think is counterintuitive to thinking about white wines. Is wines have this. Chenin is completely counterintuitive from many standpoints to what you think of as a white wine. Can you speak to that a little?
No, absolutely. It's so interesting because when you said the thing about the other winemaker that you said has a red wine structure to the wines, I always say I make white wines for red wine drinkers. because of that structure, because of that framework that the wines have. And it's not because they're, tannic or skin contact or bold or in your face. It's one of the inherent elements, characteristics of Chenin Blanc, and is so fun to play with. And texture is such an important quality in wine. When you eat food, one of the first things you think about is texture. And when people don't like a certain food, for me it's carrots, it's because of the texture. So texture and wine, it just totally makes sense that is what would attract you or put you off on a certain wine. The saltiness that you get from it just works so well on a palate, and therefore also makes it incredibly versatile with a huge range of food.
Totally. I mean, I hesitate to dive into it already. Maybe before we do go into the straw wine, can you just talk a little bit about kind of reduction and how you see that as part of because I always think about every aspect of wine. We talked about wood. I see the same thing with whole cluster, and I think about things that get in the way of terroir, and there are always things that are beneficial in the right doses. It's all about balance and kind of every aspect of wine, of life. I think that balance is the key. Can you talk about a reduction and how you think of that as a winemaker?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, in general, Chenin is one of the varieties that loves oxidation and it loves reduction as well. So it's quite fun to experiment with. Reduction can come from to generalize, two different ways of winemaking. One is to be incredibly protective, where you're using, you're not letting it touch oxygen its whole life. You're protecting it along its way, lots of sulfur, very closed environment. And there's that kind of reduction, which for me can be quite stinky and maybe overwhelm a wine. And then there's also the type of reduction that you get from oxidation, where you really play with that redox potential. And I have to say, as a winemaker, I love that because it improves the longevity of the wine. And going back to texture, it improves the texture of the wine as well. So by achieving that, you're browning the juice when you're harvest the grapes and you're pressing the grapes. You're letting oxidation take place then, because the theory is that anything that can oxidize that would be in a future wine oxidizes out in the juice, and then the natural settling process stays behind. You can either leave it quite oxidative like that, and you get those real kind of bruised appley characteristics in Chenin, or if you, after fermentation and after positive aldehyde development, you can shut it down. You can put it in a reductive environment then. But instead of being that stinky kind of reduction, you get much more of a minerally reduction. More of those salty characters. And that's a style I like very much. And that kind of reduction can almost be a magnifying glass on terroir, whereas the other kind of reduction can be like soundproofing on terroir. I don't know. I couldn't think of another word.
Well, no, but you're absolutely right. It basically interferes with the translation of the place, and I so agree with that salty kind of subtle reduction, that saline quality is a super positive, just in the right dose, and I think that is the magic of doing it. And I think there is a tendency today to push that too far, and it does get in the way. Whether it's Chardonnay or Chenin Blanc. And I think that's just like wood, just like anything. And it makes me think of your beautiful Syrahs, which we'll have to talk about another time, which that's a completely different story. But before, I think we've only got 3 or 4 more minutes. I want to talk about the straw wine because I think it's a very unique wine. It also shows, again, the versatility of Chenin. It's also very much connected to the place you are because of the method of drying the grapes, and kind of what you do is unique. It has to do with the wind. It's done outside. Can you talk a little bit about the straw wine? I've got the 18 half bottle.
Yeah. So straw wine or vindipie or pisito is another style that's made with the same concept, where you don't leave the grapes hanging on the vine to ripen to become very sweet. They're actually cut off the vine at normal ripeness. And that's because those styles of wine are typically made in warmer climates, like Tuscany or the Rhone, where you want to preserve as much acidity as possible, not just have it completely ripen and get sweet, but then have no acidity, because then it's just going to be cloying and heavy and cumbersome. So it's cut off the vine, dried off the vine. We're quite lucky because of the climate I was telling you about. We're able to do it outside. So in a lot of other wine growing regions, they tend to utilize, the rafters of a barn or dry it inside somehow, and it can take many months and get quite volatile. We're a warm, dry, breezy area, so we're able to dry it outside in a quicker time, only a few weeks. So it's quite it keeps it cleaner. It's more, it's easier to handle. So we take it to the winery. We do crush it because now we're dealing with raisins. It takes 2 days to press because it's dripping like honey, and it takes usually around 10 months to ferment. And in that time, the fermentation, you have a lot of sugar, but with that acid concentration, you have a lot of freshness and layers of more marmalade-y characteristics because of the long, slow fermentation. But the most important thing in straw wine is that concentration of acidity.
And it's only 9% alcohol. Is that correct? It's low alcohol, good acidity and freshness. It's light on its feet for a sweet wine. It's really quite remarkable. It's not what you'd expect. So we've got a minute remaining. Thank you so much. It was just a delight to walk through the wines. A really beautiful lineup. It's unique, every single wine, and it's really kind of it's so much fun to taste them in this fashion. And having done the other Chenins recently, it's really remarkable. I'm looking forward to see you again. We'll have Spam, or is it either Italian food or no? We had 2 epic meals with some great people. So I look forward to that again soon.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your support, and thank you for putting this on. It's been so fun. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.